January 15, 1994, and the small town of Gunnison, Colorado, was blanketed under 2 feet of fresh snow from a storm that had passed through overnight, creating a winter wonderland that had local children eager to play outside. The Morrison family lived on Maple Street in a quiet residential neighborhood with large yards and mature trees, and their backyard bordered a green belt with open space that stretched for several acres before meeting the forest edge. Caleb Morrison was 8 years old that Saturday morning, a boy with curly red hair, green eyes, freckles across his nose, and an adventurous spirit that made him love exploring outdoors in all seasons. He wore navy blue snow pants, a bright orange puffer jacket with reflective stripes, black waterproof boots, red mittens, and a green knit beanie, and he carried a plastic snow shovel he'd gotten for Christmas to build snow forts. Caleb had eaten breakfast with his parents Scott and Jennifer Morrison, and his older sister Emma, who was 12, and at 9:30 a.m. he'd asked permission to go play in the backyard in the fresh snow. Jennifer had agreed on the condition that Caleb stay where she could see him from the kitchen window, and she'd told him to come back inside in 30 minutes to warm up and drink hot chocolate. "Stay in our yard, don't go past the fence into the green belt," Jennifer instructed. "I want to be able to see your orange jacket the whole time, okay?" Caleb nodded enthusiastically and ran outside into the pristine snow, immediately beginning to dig and build what he announced would be the best snow fort ever near the back fence of the Morrison property. The backyard was approximately 60 feet deep with a wooden split rail fence marking the property line, and beyond that fence the green belt stretched with untouched snow covering the open field. Jennifer watched from the kitchen window as Caleb worked on his snow fort, occasionally glancing up to check on him while she cleaned breakfast dishes and prepared ingredients for lunch. At 9:42 a.m., Jennifer looked up and saw Caleb standing near the back fence, and he appeared to be looking at something in the green belt beyond their property, standing still rather than digging in the snow. The phone rang, and Jennifer answered it while still watching Caleb through the window, and she spoke with her mother for approximately 2 to 3 minutes about plans for an upcoming family gathering. When Jennifer ended the call at 9:45 a.m. and looked back toward the yard, Caleb was no longer visible near the fence or anywhere in the backyard, and his orange jacket wasn't visible against the white snow. Jennifer's first thought was that Caleb had gone to the side yard or front of the house, perhaps to get more snow from areas she'd told him he could access, and she called his name from the back door. But there was no response, and when Jennifer walked outside into the cold morning air calling Caleb's name, she realized something was terribly wrong because of what she saw in the snow. Caleb's footprints were clearly visible in the pristine snow, showing where he'd run from the back door to the fence area where he'd been building his fort, and the prints continued under the fence into the green belt. The footprints led approximately 40 yards into the open field in a straight line, and then they simply stopped in the middle of untouched snow with no indication of where Caleb had gone from that point. There were no other footprints near Caleb's, no vehicle tracks, no signs of struggle or disturbance in the snow, just his small boot prints leading from the yard into the field and ending abruptly in an area with nothing around. In approximately 2 to 3 minutes, while his mother talked on the phone and watched intermittently through a kitchen window, 8-year-old Caleb Morrison walked into a snow-covered field and vanished, leaving only his footprints behind. If this mysterious case has captured your attention, make sure you're subscribed for more unsolved mysteries. Hit that like button and comment where you're watching from or what you think happened. Now let's continue. Jennifer screamed for Scott, and within seconds both parents were running into the green belt following Caleb's footprints through the deep snow, calling his name and expecting to see him just ahead, playing, or hurt. But the footprints led to the spot where they ended, approximately 40 yards from the Morrison fence, and there was nothing there except pristine snow surrounding the final prints. Scott ran in widening circles from that spot, looking for any indication of where Caleb had gone, but the snow in all directions was undisturbed except for the single line of boot prints leading from their yard. Jennifer called 911 at 9:52 a.m., and she was hysterical, explaining that her son had walked into a field and his footprints just stopped with no explanation, and the dispatcher immediately sent police and search and rescue. Gunnison police arrived at 10:05 a.m., and Officer David Martinez walked into the green belt, following the same path the Morrisons had taken, examining Caleb's footprints that led to the inexplicable stopping point. The footprints were clear and distinct in the fresh snow, showing the tread pattern of Caleb's boots, and they indicated a normal walking pace with no signs of running or distress in the stride length or depth. Martinez examined the area where the prints ended, looking for any explanation such as Caleb being picked up or climbing onto something. But there was nothing, just the final 2 boot impressions surrounded by untouched snow. The snow in a 50-foot radius around the ending point was pristine and undisturbed, showing no other footprints, no vehicle tracks, no drag marks, nothing that would explain how an 8-year-old could disappear from that spot. Search and rescue teams arrived by 10:30 a.m. with bloodhounds, and the dogs were given Caleb's scent from clothing in his bedroom, and they tracked from the Morrison backyard following the same path the footprints showed. The dogs tracked to the exact spot where the footprints ended, and then the handlers reported something disturbing. The dogs became confused and agitated, circling the area without establishing any direction for continued tracking. "It's like the scent just ends here," the lead handler told investigators. "The dogs are telling us the trail stops at this spot, which shouldn't be possible unless he was picked up, but there's no evidence of anyone else being here." By noon, over 100 volunteers were searching the greenbelt and surrounding areas, walking in grid patterns through the snow and calling Caleb's name, but finding nothing except the mysterious line of footprints. Helicopters joined the search, flying low over the area and using thermal imaging to scan for any heat signature that might indicate Caleb was sheltering somewhere or had been buried in the snow. But the thermal scans revealed nothing, and the bright orange jacket Caleb wore should have been visible from the air if he was anywhere in the open areas being searched. Detective Robert Chen arrived at 1 p.m. and immediately recognized the case as something extraordinary and deeply troubling, because the physical evidence made no logical sense. "Footprints don't just end in the middle of a field," Chen told his team. "There has to be an explanation, either something we're not seeing or something that happened that we haven't considered yet." Chen theorized that someone might have been waiting in the greenbelt, possibly lying in the snow or hidden somehow, and had grabbed Caleb when he reached that spot, carrying him away. But this theory struggled to explain the complete absence of any other footprints or disturbance in the snow, because even if someone had been lying in wait, they would have left tracks approaching that location or leaving with Caleb. Another theory suggested that a helicopter or some kind of aircraft had hovered over that spot and had somehow lifted Caleb straight up, explaining why the footprints ended with no tracks leading away. But this idea seemed far-fetched, and nobody in the neighborhood reported hearing or seeing any aircraft that morning, and helicopter rotors would have disturbed the snow with downwash, which hadn't occurred. By Sunday, the search had expanded to cover a 10-mile radius from the Morrison home, with teams checking abandoned buildings, mine shafts, caves, and any location where an 8-year-old might have ended up. The greenbelt and surrounding forest were searched exhaustively, with volunteers walking shoulder to shoulder through the snow, checking behind every tree and in every depression where someone might be hidden. FBI was contacted given the bizarre circumstances and potential for abduction, and Special Agent Catherine Wells arrived from Denver with resources and experience from unusual missing persons cases. Agent Wells interviewed the Morrisons extensively about Caleb's personality and whether he might have wandered off in an unexpected direction after his footprints ended, perhaps jumping from spot to spot to confuse his mother. But Jennifer insisted Caleb wouldn't have played such a trick, and even if he had, there would be evidence of where he'd jumped to, and the snow showed nothing except those final prints. The plastic snow shovel Caleb had been carrying was found at the spot where his footprints ended, lying in the snow as if he'd dropped it, and this discovery was both a clue and a deepening of the mystery. Weather records were examined to determine if wind could have blown snow over additional footprints, erasing evidence of where Caleb had gone. But meteorologists confirmed conditions had been calm that morning with no wind. Geologists were consulted about whether sinkholes or ground collapses could occur in that area, potentially swallowing Caleb and the snow covering the hole, but surveys found no such features in the greenbelt. By late January, the intensive daily search operations had been scaled back after 2 weeks produced no trace of Caleb, despite thousands of volunteer hours and the most extensive investigation Gunnison had ever conducted. The case generated national attention with Caleb's photo appearing on television and in newspapers, his curly red hair and freckled face becoming an image that millions recognized, and his orange jacket a symbol of the mystery. The footprints that ended in the middle of the field were photographed extensively and analyzed by experts from various fields, trying to explain the impossible disappearance. Forensic specialists examined the prints for any signs of alteration or staging, wondering if someone had created false footprints or erased additional tracks, but the snow showed no evidence of manipulation. The theory that Caleb had been abducted by someone in an aircraft gained some traction when investigators learned that a private helicopter company operated from an airfield 30 miles away, though no flights were reported that morning. But attempts to connect any helicopter to Caleb's disappearance found no evidence, and the complete absence of disturbed snow beneath where such a craft would have hovered remained unexplained. Some investigators theorized that Caleb had somehow walked backward in his own footprints, retracing his steps perfectly to create the illusion that the trail ended, though this seemed impossible for an 8-year-old. Experiments were conducted with children Caleb's age to see if they could walk backward in snow, matching their forward prints exactly, and while possible for short distances, doing it for 40 yards without deviation proved extremely difficult. By 1998, the case had essentially gone cold with periodic reviews, and Caleb Morrison became one of those rare disappearances where the physical evidence seemed to defy logical explanation. Paranormal researchers became fascinated with the case, proposing theories ranging from alien abduction to interdimensional portals, though law enforcement dismissed such speculation as unhelpful. True crime writers featured Caleb's disappearance in books about unsolved mysteries, and the image of footprints ending in pristine snow became iconic in discussions of impossible vanishings. Scott and Jennifer Morrison never recovered from losing Caleb in such inexplicable circumstances, and they spent years searching and investigating every possible theory, no matter how unlikely. The family moved away from Gunnison in 2000, unable to live in the house where they could see the greenbelt from their kitchen window, and Jennifer never forgave herself for looking away during those 2 minutes. Emma grew up haunted by the loss of her younger brother, and she became a private investigator as an adult, dedicating herself to solving missing persons cases and hoping to find answers about what had happened to Caleb. Detective James Morrison took over the cold case in 2010, and he was obsessed with the footprints and the impossibility of the physical evidence, spending countless hours trying to construct a scenario that fit the facts. Morrison investigated whether military aircraft or experimental vehicles might have been in the area on January 15, 1994, wondering if classified technology could explain an abduction that left no ground traces. But Freedom of Information Act requests and military record searches produced no evidence of any aircraft or operations in the Gunnison area that morning, classified or otherwise. By 2020, Caleb would have been 34 years old, and age progression photos showed a red-haired man with freckles who might have looked like his father, though the family feared he'd died on that January morning. The case was featured on true crime podcasts in the late 2010s, and each show struggled to explain the footprints, with some proposing elaborate staging by sophisticated criminals, and others suggesting explanations that bordered on science fiction. One theory suggested that Caleb had been grabbed by someone who'd approached from directly above, possibly rappelling from a silent drone or balloon, lifting him straight up and leaving the snow undisturbed below. But this idea required technology and planning that seemed beyond what would have been available or practical in 1994, and it didn't explain why someone would target a random 8-year-old in Gunnison. The greenbelt where Caleb's footprints had ended was developed in 2015, with houses built over the area where the mystery had occurred, and some residents reported feeling uneasy about the location's history. Jennifer Morrison died in 2018 at age 62 from cancer, and she died without ever knowing what had happened to her son or why his footprints had ended in that impossible way. Her obituary mentioned that she was survived by her missing son Caleb, whose disappearance had defined her life and remained one of the most baffling unsolved cases in Colorado history. Scott continued to review the case files and search for answers, and he maintained contact with law enforcement, hoping that new technology or information might eventually explain the inexplicable. By 2024, 30 years after Caleb's disappearance, the case remained completely unsolved, with no credible leads or explanations that satisfied the physical evidence of footprints ending in untouched snow. Detective Sarah Chen reviewed the case in 2023 as part of a cold case initiative, and she brought fresh eyes and modern investigative techniques to evidence that had baffled investigators for 3 decades. Chen used advanced ground-penetrating radar to scan the area where Caleb's footprints had ended, looking for any underground features such as old tunnels or natural cavities that might explain a sudden disappearance. But the scans revealed nothing unusual beneath the surface, just normal soil composition with no voids or structures that could have swallowed an 8-year-old boy. She also obtained satellite imagery from 1994, if any existed, covering Gunnison on January 15th, hoping to see aerial evidence of vehicles or activity in the Greenbelt that ground-level investigation had missed. But satellite coverage of the area in 1994 was limited and low resolution, and the available images showed only snow-covered landscape with no discernible details about the morning Caleb disappeared. Chen interviewed everyone who'd been living in the neighborhood in 1994, many of whom still resided in Gunnison, asking if they'd seen or heard anything unusual that morning. Several neighbors remembered the search and the mystery of the footprints, but nobody recalled seeing aircraft, vehicles, or suspicious people in the area before or after Caleb vanished. One elderly man mentioned that he'd been looking out his window that morning and had noticed something he'd never reported because it seemed irrelevant: a large bird circling over the Greenbelt around 9:30 a.m. "It was probably an eagle or hawk," the man said, "just watching for rabbits or mice in the snow, but it was circling right about where they say the boys' tracks ended." This detail was noted but didn't provide any explanation for Caleb's disappearance, and Chen dismissed it as coincidental wildlife activity unrelated to the case. The theory that someone had meticulously erased their own footprints while carrying Caleb was revisited, and Chen conducted experiments to see if this was possible without leaving evidence. But every attempt to erase footprints in snow left visible signs of disturbance, compressed snow, or altered texture that would have been noticed by investigators, and the pristine field in 1994 showed none of these markers. By 2024, advanced DNA databases and genealogical research had solved many cold cases from the 1990s, but these tools required some biological evidence or a living person to test, neither of which existed in Caleb's case. Scott Morrison, now 73, continued to visit the area where houses now stood over the spot his son had vanished, and he would stand on the sidewalk remembering the pristine field and impossible footprints. "I've spent 30 years trying to understand what happened," Scott told a documentary filmmaker in 2023, "and I'm no closer to an answer than I was that first morning when we found his tracks ending in the middle of nothing." Emma had investigated her brother's case privately for years, and she'd developed her own theory that Caleb had been taken by someone with extensive knowledge of tracking and snow conditions. She believed the abductor had approached from the forest using a route that wouldn't leave obvious tracks, had grabbed Caleb at that spot, and had carried him away using techniques that minimized footprint evidence. But even Emma admitted her theory didn't fully explain the pristine snow surrounding the final prints, and she acknowledged that something about the case defied normal investigative logic. The plastic snow shovel found at the scene had been tested repeatedly over the years for DNA or fingerprints beyond Caleb's, but it yielded no evidence pointing to anyone else's involvement. The bright orange jacket Caleb had been wearing should have made him visible for miles in the white landscape, and the fact that aerial searches never spotted it suggested he'd been taken somewhere enclosed very quickly. True crime communities online debated the case endlessly, with some convinced it was an elaborate staging by sophisticated criminals, and others believing it represented something genuinely unexplainable by conventional means. The case appeared in lists of most mysterious disappearances and unsolved cases that defy explanation, always featuring the haunting detail of footprints that simply ended with no evidence of where the person went. Gunnison erected a small memorial in a park near where the Morrison family had lived, with Caleb's photo and a plaque reading, "Caleb Morrison, 1986 to 1994, lost to mystery, never forgotten, may answers come." The question mark after 1994 acknowledged that Caleb's death was never confirmed, though statistical reality suggested he'd likely died shortly after disappearing, whether from exposure, accident, or foul play. By 2025, 31 years after Caleb Morrison walked into a snow-covered field and vanished, his case remained one of the most baffling unsolved disappearances in American history, distinguished by physical evidence that seemed impossible. The photograph of his footprints ending in pristine snow had been analyzed by countless experts from various disciplines, and none could provide a definitive explanation that accounted for all the evidence. Detective Chen continued to review the case periodically, and she maintained that somewhere in the physical evidence or witness statements was a detail that had been missed or misunderstood that would eventually explain everything. "Footprints don't end in the middle of fields without explanation," Chen stated in a 2024 interview. "Either we're missing something about what happened that morning, or the evidence was compromised in ways we haven't understood. but there is a rational explanation. But 3 decades of investigation by skilled professionals had failed to identify what that explanation might be, and the case seemed destined to remain unsolved indefinitely. Scott Morrison died in 2027 at age 76, having spent 33 years searching for answers about his son's disappearance, and he died without ever knowing what had happened in those minutes Caleb was out of sight. His final words to Emma were reportedly, "I'll find him now," suggesting he believed death would somehow reunite him with Caleb or provide answers that had eluded him in life. Emma inherited her father's extensive files on Caleb's case, boxes of documents, photos, and investigation notes that represented decades of obsessive searching, and she vowed to continue pursuing answers. The case stood as a reminder of how some disappearances resist explanation despite exhaustive investigation, and how physical evidence can sometimes seem to contradict what's known to be possible. And it highlighted the unique torture faced by families when loved ones vanish in circumstances that make no logical sense, leaving questions that may never be answered, no matter how much time passes. The green belt where Caleb disappeared no longer existed as open space, replaced by suburban homes where families lived unaware of the mystery that had occurred there decades earlier. But some longtime Gunnison residents refused to forget, and they would mention the case whenever unusual disappearances occurred elsewhere, noting that Caleb's footprints remained unexplained after 3 decades. Paranormal researchers continued to study the case as potential evidence of phenomena beyond conventional understanding, though these theories remained unproven and controversial among serious investigators. Some proposed that Caleb had encountered some kind of temporal or spatial anomaly in that field, stepping into a place or time that wasn't visible from the outside world, though such ideas existed firmly in speculation. Others suggested abduction by non-human intelligence, pointing to the complete absence of conventional evidence as proof that conventional explanations were insufficient, though this remained unprovable. The orange puffer jacket Caleb had worn became a symbol of the case, and occasionally people reported finding similar jackets in remote locations, generating brief hope before investigation eliminated any connection. True crime documentaries continued to feature Caleb's disappearance, and each one struggled with the fundamental problem: how to explain footprints ending with no evidence of where the person went. The case appeared in textbooks used to train investigators, presented as an example of how physical evidence can sometimes seem contradictory or impossible, and how important it is to remain objective despite baffling circumstances. Emma became a prominent missing persons investigator, and she spoke publicly about living in the shadow of an unsolved mystery, encouraging other families to never stop searching even when cases seemed impossible. "My brother's footprints are still out there in the snow in photographs and evidence files," Emma told audiences, "and someday someone will look at them and see what we've all missed, and will finally understand what happened that morning." The case proved that even in modern times with advanced technology and investigative techniques, some disappearances remain completely inexplicable, defying our understanding of what's possible. It demonstrated that 8-year-olds can vanish in broad daylight just yards from their homes, leaving behind evidence that raises more questions than it answers. And it showed that families can search for 30 years without finding closure, living with mysteries that seem designed to resist solution no matter how much effort is expended. As of 2025, the case of Caleb Morrison remains open and unsolved, and the photograph of his footprints ending in pristine snow continues to haunt investigators and true crime enthusiasts who study impossible disappearances. Detective Chen believes that somewhere in Gunnison or beyond, someone knows what happened to Caleb Morrison, and she holds hope that deathbed confessions or new information might eventually emerge. "Someone, somewhere knows the answer," Chen says. "Whether it's a person who was involved or someone who saw something they didn't report, or evidence we haven't discovered yet, the truth exists, and I believe it can still be found. But until that truth emerges, if it ever does, Caleb Morrison remains among the missing, his fate one of the most perplexing mysteries in the annals of unsolved disappearances." The last image of Caleb shows him running out the Morrison back door into fresh snow, eager to build a fort, captured by a home video camera his father had been using that morning. And somewhere in Colorado, in the vast wilderness that surrounds small mountain towns, or in memories someone has kept hidden for 31 years, the answer to what happened to Caleb Morrison exists. The footprints that ended in the middle of a field represent not just physical evidence, but a family's grief, a community's bewilderment, and a reminder that some questions may remain unanswered forever. Detective Chen continues to review the case, and she's instructed future investigators to remain vigilant for any new information, because she believes that even after 31 years, the truth about Caleb Morrison can still be discovered. The footprints tell us he walked into that field, Chen says, and they tell us he stopped at that spot, but they don't tell us what happened next. And until we understand that, Caleb's case will remain the most baffling mystery I've ever encountered. And in Gunnison, Colorado, where a little boy in an orange jacket once went to play in the snow on a January morning, his story endures as proof that some disappearances defy explanation, and some mysteries may never be solved.